I have learned over years in this line of work that disappearances rarely begin with silence. They begin with tremors, subtle shifts in the ground beneath a family's life. Voices change habits, fracture, truth erodes grain by grain, until one day the world looks up and realizes something is terribly wrong. That realization came to me in late 2019 when the names Tylee Ryan and Joshua G. Vallow first crossed my desk, carried in by a tired detective whose eyes carried the weight of a question no one had yet dared to verbalize. Where were the children of Vallow Daybell, and why did no one seem able to answer that simple question? I remember that morning with uncomfortable clarity. The coffee was burnt, the office too cold, the sky overcast, with the color of unspoken dread. I was Miller Files investigator for hire, often called, when cases stop behaving like cases and start behaving like stories people are afraid to tell. 2 missing children, months without contact. A mother, newly married and unreachable, a stepfather whose religious visions claimed to decode the end of the world. Everything about it smelled wrong from the moment the first folder hit my table. The official request was straightforward. Assistance needed in locating minors, believed missing since September. But any seasoned investigator knows that when a mother does not report her children missing, and when she flees the state while refusing to allow authorities to verify their safety, you are no longer dealing with a simple disappearance. You are dealing with a truth that someone has worked very hard to bury. I began with what every investigator begins with: the last known appearances. The last confirmed sighting of 16-year-old Tylee took place on a cool September morning at Yellowstone National Park. A photo captured her beside her little brother, her hair pulled back against the wind, her expression a mixture of amusement and reluctance, as though she had reluctantly agreed to one last picture. On the surface, it looked like a family trip, the final snapshot in a series of ordinary moments. But when I studied that image long enough, I sensed something else beneath it, a tension invisible to the untrained eye. Tylee's arm positioned protectively around JJ's eyes, slightly downturned and distracted. Laurie's smile, too bright, stretched thin like plastic pulled taut across a fracture. Families rarely realize when they are recording a moment the world will later look at as evidence. The last confirmed sighting of 7-year-old JJ followed days later at the Kennedy Elementary School in Rexburg, Idaho. A grainy shot from an external camera showed him walking down the hallway, backpack, bouncing a child unaware that every step he took was one step closer to disappearing from the world's eyes. After that, JJ never returned to class. His mother provided shifting explanations, none of which aligned with reality. She said he was with friends. She said he was homeschooled. She said he was safe. The truth was that every answer she gave pushed investigators deeper into the dark. As I traced the timeline backward and forward, a pattern emerged, one that became the spine of this case. Wherever Vallow went, death and disappearance followed. Her ex-husband, Charles Vallow, shot by Laurie's brother, Alex Cox, under circumstances too tidy to be accidental. The sudden death of Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy, ruled natural with alarming speed, despite witnesses reporting she had been in perfect health. The abrupt relocation to Hawaii by Laurie and Chad mere weeks after Tammy's death, as though they were boarding a plane to a honeymoon rather than escaping the collapsing edges of a lie. There is a specific ache that grows in the chest of an investigator the moment he knows the truth is not simply hiding, but being strangled. That ache began to take root the deeper I went through Laurie's digital footprint. Emails written with an eerie sense of destiny. Messages exchanged with Chad about chosen missions and spiritual portals. Lists of people categorized as light or dark, depending on supposed spiritual purity. In their shared language, darkness meant danger. Darkness meant obstruction. Darkness eventually meant expendable. It was in December, months after the children were last seen, that law enforcement conducted the first major welfare check. The officers who knocked on Laurie's door were met with ease too rehearsed and assurance too polished. The children were elsewhere, she said. They were safe, she said. She did not specify where. When pressed, her story disintegrated. By the next morning, she and Chad were gone, leaving behind a townhouse that felt like a stage abandoned mid-performance. There were no children's belongings actively used, no signs of recent presence, no indication the siblings had lived there for months. It was the absence that screamed. I traveled to Idaho myself shortly afterward. The cold there has a way of changing the sound of your breath, making it sharper. The air felt as though it remembered something the people were trying to forget. Neighbors described Laurie as warm and charismatic, at least in the beginning. Then her conversation shifted, orbiting around prophecies, dark spirits, and end times. She claimed Tylee and JJ were special chosen, marked for roles only she understood. Her brother Alex was fiercely loyal, an enforcer in a story he believed was righteous. Chad, the writer of apocalyptic fiction turned self-appointed prophet, fed Laurie's fantasies until they became indistinguishable from purpose. One neighbor's voice shook when she told me she had once seen JJ playing in the yard, chasing the family dog. A normal day, a normal child. Weeks later, the house fell silent. No toys outside, no noise, no children, as though someone had erased their existence with deliberate hands. My next step was to build a psychological profile. Laurie's past relationships provided the clearest pattern. Each husband described her as magnetic, unpredictable, driven by conviction that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. Laurie believed she was chosen, favored, destined for greatness. People who obstructed her, even unintentionally, became villains in her worldview. Her children, tragically, were no exception. When a mother begins to believe her children are not her own, but vessels compromised by dark forces, the danger becomes immediate and catastrophic. During this phase of the investigation, I received a recording from a confidential source. It captured Laurie speaking in a small religious circle, describing revelations she believed were sent to her. She spoke of portals, spirit dimensions, soul ratings, and missions assigned by divine authority. Her tone was peaceful, serene even. That serenity frightened me more than rage ever could. Rage can be reasoned with. Serenity born from delusion cannot. By late January, the case had become national news. The world was asking the same question that stared back at me from every file on my desk. Where were Tylee and JJ? The parents would not answer. Chad avoided questions with spiritual phrases that meant nothing. Laurie fled to Hawaii, wearing leis and sunglasses, while investigators hunted for her children half a continent away. The arrest of Laurie Vallow in February 2020 should have felt like progress, but instead it felt like confirmation. She was charged with desertion and non-support of her children. Yet even in handcuffs, she smiled a smile that suggested she knew something the rest of us had yet to understand. That smile haunted the early stages of the investigation because it told me two things. First, she believed she was protected by destiny. Second, she believed the children were no longer an obstacle to her purpose. As I reconstructed every known movement of Laurie, Chad, and Alex in the weeks surrounding the children's disappearance, a chilling pattern crystallized. Strategically timed messages, sudden apartment changes, cell phone pings in locations that contradicted testimonies, purchases of tools and supplies inconsistent with daily needs, yet consistent with concealment. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that ordinary logic could not fully decode this case. To understand their decisions, one had to understand the world Laurie and Chad built. A world governed not by law, but by prophecy. That world began long before the children vanished. Chad's books had been laying the foundation for years, fiction that blurred too easily into doctrine for those desperate to feel chosen. Laurie entered his sphere already primed for extreme belief. Together they created a closed universe where they were saviors and others were either divine allies or dark impediments. The children in their eyes fell into the latter category. I interviewed friends and relatives across states. Their testimonies painted a portrait of escalating fanaticism. One relative said Laurie had once declared that she no longer saw JJ's spirit in his body. This was a warning sign so stark it seized my breath the moment I heard it. Another friend recalled Laurie insisting that Tylee had become difficult because forces of darkness were attacking her. These were not metaphors, but beliefs Laurie treated as fact. Parents see their children through frames of love and familiarity. Laurie saw hers through a filter constructed by Chad's apocalyptic teachings. In March 2020, I stood in front of a storage unit in Rexburg that Laurie had rented. Surveillance footage showed Laurie and Alex arriving multiple times unloading items belonging to the children. Bikes, backpacks, pictures. The kinds of belongings a child leaves behind only when they are no longer returning home. Standing inside that unit, surrounded by orphaned objects, I felt the weight of what had been lost long before their physical disappearance. These objects held memories, evidence of life, paused abruptly and violently. Objects remain honest, even when people refuse to. As weeks stretched into months, without discovery, the case transformed from a search into an excavation of belief systems, lies, deceptions, and calculated maneuvers. Public pressure intensified. Media scrutiny increased. But in the quiet hours of night, when I returned to the files, I saw only their faces. Tylee, with her guarded smile. JJ with his bright eyes and boundless energy. Children whose world should have been protected by those who loved them. Children failed in ways word cannot fully articulate. The final weeks leading up to the June discovery were a blur of leads, misdirection, and grim anticipation. Something had shifted in the air as though the case itself was tightening around a truth long restrained. When investigators obtained the warrant to search Chad Daybell's property, I knew with a certainty that gnawed at my bones that we were approaching the moment no investigator once yet must confront. Answers were coming, but answers and hope rarely arrive together. I will never forget stepping onto that property, the Daybell land, stretching outward in quiet defiance of the horror it concealed. The ground was uneven, soft in certain places where it should have been firm. The dogs alerted almost instantly, pulling handlers toward a patch of earth near a tree that seemed to sag under an unseen burden. As I stood there, I understood that the story of the children had not ended when they disappeared. It had ended here beneath this soil in the hands of people who believed killing them was an act of divine necessity. The rest, as they say, is waiting in the earth. The second stage of any investigation is the stage where truth stops whispering from the edges and begins to speak directly to you. It no longer hides in documents or shadows or the unsteady memories of witnesses. It becomes a force that knocks on the door of your mind until you let it in. That was the stage I found myself in after the discovery on the Daybell property. I had spent months chasing the trail of 2 children. Now I was staring into the machinery that had consumed them. To understand the crime, I had to understand the world that created it. The world of Laurie Vallow and Chad Daybell did not start as a storm. It evolved from seeds of belief that slowly grew into a system of logic disconnected from the earth beneath it. Religious extremism rarely begins with violence. It begins with fascination. It begins with conversations that seem harmless at first, spoken in the privacy of living rooms and in the soft hush of spiritual gatherings. Words like destiny, calling, chosen. When those words go unchallenged long enough, they solidify into doctrine. That doctrine becomes the compass by which a person steers their life. And in this story, that compass pointed straight into darkness, even as its believers insisted it led toward light. I began to read every text message and recorded conversation between Lori and Chad that had been recovered. Their world had its own vocabulary, one that at first looked like fiction or spiritual metaphor, but in truth carried lethal weight. They spoke of people being possessed by dark spirits, a belief that rewrote their perception of anyone who challenged them. They built elaborate spiritual rankings for family members, assigning numerical ratings to their souls. In their system, a person could shift from light to dark without any external crime, simply by opposing the desires or visions of the couple. Once labeled dark, a person's life lost value in their eyes. This belief system had no boundaries. It swallowed friends, relatives, spouses, and eventually children. That was the moment I understood the true nature of what I was dealing with. This was not simply delusion. This was a manufactured cosmology that justified elimination. To understand how Lori had embraced this world, I needed to understand her before Chad. People who knew her described her as charismatic, magnetic, drawn to intensity. She had a history of searching for identity in others. She adopted language, quickly absorbed belief structures effortlessly, and framed her life with whichever narrative made her feel central and grand. That psychological hunger created a perfect storm when she met Chad Daybell, a man who spent years writing apocalyptic novels and studying scripture through a lens bent by fear and imagination. Chad believed he could see beyond the veil separating mortality from spirit. He believed spirit spoke to him, assigning him missions. When Lori entered his life, he told her that they knew each other in previous lifetimes. He told her that their union was preordained by heavenly counsels. He told her that the children in her care were obstacles to their divine mission. If a person is already primed to believe in cosmic significance, hearing these words does more than persuade. It transforms. I listened to a recorded conversation from a small meeting they held with like-minded followers. Chad spoke softly with a calmness that was dangerous precisely because it carried conviction. He described two kinds of spirits that lived within bodies, light spirits and dark spirits. Light spirits were allies in the coming end times. Dark spirits were bodies hijacked by unnatural forces. Those dark spirits, he said, would resist the work of salvation. According to him, their removal was not murder, but deliverance. Lori listened with the fervor of someone who had finally found the story she believed she had been born into. The tragedy of this case is not only that Lori believed Chad, it is that she wanted to. It allowed her to see herself not as a woman overwhelmed by life, but as a divine warrior preparing the world for its cleansing. A belief like that is armor, and armor once worn too long becomes impossible to remove. The deeper I went, the more I realized this was not a story of an unsuspecting woman manipulated by a prophet. It was a story of two people who amplified each other's distorted convictions until every moral line disappeared. Delusion becomes most dangerous when shared. As I reconstructed their communications, one set of messages chilled me more than the rest. In them, Lori and Chad assigned spiritual statuses to people closest to them. Chad claimed he had received spiritual readings indicating that Tylee had become dark. Not mischievous or problematic, but dark in a metaphysical sense. Lori accepted this reading without hesitation. The mother-daughter bond fractured in that moment in a way no one could see externally, but it was catastrophic. JJ was next. Chad wrote that he had become dark as well. Lori's replies were short, almost relieved. She spoke of the children as though she had already emotionally detached from them, as though she believed their bodies were no longer their own. I paused after reading that sequence, sitting in the dim light of my office long after sunset. I realized then just how fully Laurie had surrendered her role as a mother. She had replaced it with a role in a cosmic play that existed only in the minds of her and Chad. But the cult of light and dark was not limited to the children. It extended to Chad's wife, Tammy. By late 2019, Chad told others that Tammy was struggling spiritually. He assigned her a dark rating in his spiritual system. Days later, she died in her sleep, a death initially brushed aside as natural. When a belief system repeatedly predicts a person's spiritual demise right before their physical demise, that is not prophecy, that is planning. My interviews with people who had once been close to Laurie painted her transformation in painful detail. One friend described Laurie before meeting Chad as vibrant and funny, someone who could light up a room. Over time, the same friend saw the brightness twist into intensity. Conversations once filled with normal frustrations became filled with cosmic interpretations. A spilled drink became a warning from spirits. A disagreement from a family member became an attack from dark forces. Once you interpret the world that way, everything becomes a battlefield. And in a battlefield, casualties are expected. I needed to understand the structure of this belief system, not because I believed any of it, but because understanding it was the only way to predict the behaviors that emerged from it. The writings Chad produced over the years provided the foundation. His books seemed fictional, but they served as blueprints for his worldview. In them, realms of light and darkness battled for influence over chosen individuals. Death was often framed as a transition rather than an end. Souls that were corrupted needed release. He called it purification. I called it indoctrination. The effect on Laurie was immediate and profound. Her expressions changed. Her voice changed. People described her as floating rather than walking. She spoke with serenity even when discussing topics that should have brought concern or fear. That serenity was the sign that she had stepped fully inside the alternate world Chad created. And once inside, she never came back out. The more time I spent inside their communication logs, the more disturbing it became. They did not whisper or hint about removing obstacles. They framed it as fulfilling missions. They believed they were saving the world from unseen forces. When a person believes their actions serve a higher cosmic purpose, morality becomes negotiable. Lives become assignments. Children become test cases. I interviewed one individual who attended a private gathering with Laurie not long before the children disappeared. The witness described Laurie speaking with fierce conviction about the end of days. She said the veil between worlds was thinning, that chosen warriors were being summoned. The witness said Laurie seemed almost euphoric, as though she could smell destiny in the room. That euphoria masked the deeper truth that she was preparing her mind to justify an unforgivable act. One moment in the investigation still sits heavy in my memory. I was reviewing a series of audio notes Laurie sent to a close friend. In them, she spoke about JJ becoming difficult. She framed normal childhood frustrations as evidence of spiritual decay. She said she knew his body was being used by a dark entity. Her tone was not angry, it was resigned. It was the resignation of someone who believed they were facing a problem that had only one solution. As I listened, I felt an anger rise in me that I rarely allow into my work. It was the anger of knowing that a story had already been written in her mind, and that the children had no way to escape it. They were characters trapped in a script drafted by two adults who believed they were authors of destiny. The cult of light and dark also operated through secrecy. Laurie became increasingly isolated from friends who questioned her. She cut ties with family members who pushed back. She moved homes repeatedly under the guise of spiritual prompting. Isolation is not just a symptom of extremism. It is fuel. It is the environment in which distorted beliefs calcify into certainty. I spent time studying every movement Laurie and Chad made during the critical weeks of September. Their decisions were not random or chaotic. They were purposeful. They removed the children from the public eye. They stopped taking them places where they would be seen. They maintained outward calm while constructing a narrative of dark spirits inhabiting innocent bodies. They were preparing themselves psychologically for the act they believed would free the children's spirits. This realization haunted me. They did not see the killings as murder. They saw them as salvation. When you view death as liberation, the line between protection and destruction disappears. The investigation then shifted into understanding the role of Alex Cox, Laurie's brother. He was the enforcer within the belief structure. He believed Laurie and Chad completely. His loyalty was unwavering. Phone records placed him at critical locations during crucial times. His presence was not accidental. He was a participant in the narrative. The tragedy is that he too would die before the truth emerged, fully leaving behind only digital footprints and actions that painted a chilling picture. As I pieced these elements together, the question that haunted the nation grew into a deeper, more disturbing question for me. The public asked where the children were. I asked who the children had become in the eyes of the people who were supposed to love them. In the cult of light and dark, they were no longer seen as children. They were seen as impediments. They were seen as vessels contaminated by darkness. They were seen as bodies that no longer housed the spirits Laurie believed she knew. And once a mother convinces herself her children are gone spiritually, the physical act that follows becomes tragically simple. The final days before the children vanished reflected a frightening clarity. Laurie withdrew them from routine, restricted their visibility, and placed them in the care of only those who shared her beliefs. The storm had gathered completely by then. It only needed the final push. There are moments in an investigation when the world around you becomes unbearably still. The air thickens. Time slows with the weight of something inevitable. That was the atmosphere the morning we stepped onto the Daybell property with a search warrant that would change the trajectory of the case forever. I arrived early before the teams were fully assembled, and the sky sat heavy with a strange silence that pressed against the skin like a warning. I had walked into crime scenes for decades, but this one felt different in a way that cannot be fully explained, only felt. It felt as though the ground itself knew what it had been forced to carry. The Daybell residence stood quiet against the Idaho landscape, an ordinary home wrapped in an extraordinary darkness. Beyond it stretched the acreage where investigators hoped to answer the question that had haunted the nation for nearly a year. Where were Tylee and JJ? The property carried an eerie calm that morning, broken only by the distant hum of vehicles and the soft crunch of boots in the early soil. As I looked across the field, I felt both dread and certainty. Whatever we were about to find, it belonged to a story that had already ended long before we arrived. Search teams began moving systematically. Cadaver dogs were released, weaving along the perimeter of the lot with purposeful momentum. Every step felt like we were walking deeper into a truth that I had mentally prepared for, yet still hoped would not materialize. I had studied their worldview, their delusions, their escalating violence, and still part of me clung to the irrational hope that perhaps the children were alive, hidden somewhere waiting for discovery. Hope is a dangerous companion in this line of work. It lingers long after logic has stepped aside. The dogs alerted near the fire pit first, their bodies stiffened, noses locked toward a patch of earth that seemed indistinguishable from the rest of the yard. The handlers exchanged glances, and a quiet understanding passed through the air. The excavation team was called forward. As they marked the location, I stepped back, watching the scene unfold from a few feet away. Because sometimes distance is the only way to endure what comes next. The soil gave way too easily disturbed before softened by prior digging. Shovels scraped against something unnatural. A moment passed quiet and sharp, like the space between lightning and thunder. Then one of the investigators exhaled a long breath that told me everything before he even spoke. They had found remains. Time did not stop, but it stretched unnaturally. People moved with deliberate slowness, as though each motion carved itself into memory. A small wrapped shape emerged from the earth. Plastic, tape, layers meant to conceal rather than protect. I felt a sting in my throat and forced myself to remain observational, analytical, present. This was evidence, I reminded myself. This was truth. But beneath that reminder was grief, old and familiar, circling like a wolf at the edges of the mind. Within minutes, confirmation came through. The remains were consistent with J.J. Vallow, the boy with the bright eyes and restless energy whose face had stared back at me from countless photographs over the past months. His body had been bound in a manner that revealed intention and deliberation. No panic, no chaos, a decision executed. I stepped away from the scene for a moment, not out of weakness, but reverence. Some discoveries demand silence rather than reaction. I found myself staring at the ground, imagining the last moments of a child who should have been safe in the arms of those sworn to love him. The cruelty of delusion is that it convinces people that harm is holy. J.J. had been caught in that lie, and now the lie lay exposed in the summer air. But the search was not over. The dogs alerted again several yards away near a tree whose branches drooped low as though burdened by a secret. The ground beneath it bore subtle signs of disturbance. The excavation team approached with heavy gloves and heavier hearts. I moved closer this time. I needed to witness it fully to understand not only the action but the imprint it left on the earth. The digging began again. The soil resisted slightly as though reluctant to reveal what it held. The smell reached us before the sight did. A particular scent that investigators know too well, one that speaks of time and fire and the terrible ways bodies can be altered. When the first fragments surfaced, charred and broken, I understood instantly what we were dealing with. Tylee had not simply been buried. She had been dismembered and burned, an act that required time planning and a level of emotional detachment that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. I felt something in me fracture quietly. Tylee had been 16, carrying all the contradictions and courage of adolescence. She had protected her little brother fiercely. She had navigated a turbulent life with resilience no child should ever need. To see the evidence of how violently her life had been erased shook me in a way I had not prepared for. This was not a simple burial. This was an obliteration, an attempt to erase her from existence entirely. The scene expanded into a coordinated surge of activity. Crime scene photographers documented every fragment. Analysts mapped the area. Pathologists collected remains with a tenderness that contrasted painfully with the brutality that had placed them there. Amid the motion, I remained still absorbing every detail, because that is what the living owe to the dead. We must bear witness. Chad Daybell watched from his porch as the discovery unfolded. His face was a canvas of shifting fear and detachment. Moments later, agents approached him, and in a move that surprised no one, they placed him under arrest. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply lowered his head, the image of a man whose fabricated prophecy had collapsed under the weight of real-world consequences. I reflected then on the monstrous simplicity of the crime. It was not committed out of rage or impulse. It was committed out of belief, the most dangerous fuel a human can carry. Laurie and Chad had convinced themselves that killing the children was an act of salvation. The horror lay not only in what they had done, but in how calmly and purposefully they had done it. As the team continued documenting the crime scene, I walked the perimeter of the property alone. The grass stirred gently in the breeze. Birds landed briefly on fence posts. The world moved on indifferent to tragedy. Yet beneath the soil lay evidence of a belief system gone feral. I tried to imagine the nights leading up to this, the conversations, the rationalizations, the rituals of justification that allowed two adults to murder children without feeling the weight of their actions. The evidence recovered that day did more than confirm a crime. It stitched together months of behavioral anomalies, spiritual rhetoric, and missing person confusion into a cohesive narrative. Everything made sense now. Every lie, every disappearance, every evasive answer had been a step toward this terrible conclusion. Later that evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in muted red, I sat in my car outside the property and closed my eyes. In the dimness behind my eyelids, the faces of the children returned, not as evidence, but as memories they never got to make. I thought of Tylee's photographs, her guarded half-smile. I thought of JJ's bright grin, the boundless movement of his young body. Photographs capture life in stillness, but what haunted me were the moments beyond the frame, the ones robbed from them forever. The aftermath of uncovering truth is rarely satisfying. There is no triumph in finding the dead. There is only clarity, and the cold realization that clarity arrived too late to save anyone. Yet clarity is necessary. It is the compass that guides the next chapter. It informs prosecution. It brings families answers, even if those answers shatter them. It is the backbone of justice, the final gift investigators can offer when prevention has failed. I returned to the office after midnight. The silence there felt different, heavier, as though the building itself knew what I carried inside me. I sat with the files spread across my desk and reviewed everything again, not because I doubted the conclusion, but because I wanted to understand every facet of how belief had become weapon. This case was no longer simply about two murdered children. It was about an ideology, a system that had malfunctioned so completely it devoured its own. What struck me most was the methodical nature of the crime, the precision, the lack of hesitation. These were not actions performed by people who were confused or panicked. They were performed by people who felt certain, perhaps too certain, that they were on the correct side of a cosmic battle no one else could see. That certainty frightened me more than any overt act of violence because it revealed that the danger did not lie in emotion, but in conviction. As dawn approached, I stepped outside the office and looked toward the horizon. A thin line of gold cut through the darkness, a reminder that the world continues, whether or not we are ready for it. I thought about the children again and wondered how long they had suffered, how long they had tried to understand what was happening to the adults they trusted. That question is one that will never be answered fully, and perhaps it should not be. Some truths are too cruel to inhabit, but other truths must be faced head-on. The discovery on the Daybell property was not just a turning point in the investigation. It was the violent unmasking of a lie. It forced the world to confront the reality that extreme belief can metastasize into atrocity when left unchecked. It reminded investigators everywhere of the responsibility we carry, the necessity of questioning not only actions but the ideologies that drive them. Kiba ends here at the moment when the earth gave back what had been taken from it. A moment of devastating clarity. A moment that marked the transition from searching for truth to demanding justice. The next chapter would unfold not in fields or forests, but in courtrooms, interviews, psychological evaluations, and the slow grinding machinery of law. The truth had been unearthed. Now it had to be carried. The truth is never enough on its own. It must be presented shaped, spoken aloud in a courtroom where the past is reconstructed piece by painful piece. Evidence is only the beginning. Justice is the journey that follows. The morning of the trial, as I walked toward the courthouse with a stack of files under my arm, I felt the unmistakable weight of that journey. The world now knew what had happened to Tylee and JJ. But knowledge is not closure. Closure only comes when the system declares in front of all who watched that their lives mattered. The courthouse steps were crowded with journalists, mothers, former neighbors, strangers who had followed the case for months. Everyone searching for something different. Answers. Accountability, maybe even redemption. As I pushed through the doors and entered the long corridor, I could feel the echo of their expectations clinging to me. It is a peculiar burden being one of the few who has touched every chapter of a case from disappearance to discovery. But burden is part of the work. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. On one side sat prosecutors, their expressions stern and controlled the arc of their responsibility drawn clearly in the lines of their faces. On the opposite side sat Lori Vallow, dressed neatly, hands folded in a posture far too serene for the weight of the accusations against her. She stared forward as though she were a guest attending her own trial rather than the woman at its center. Her composure was almost defiant, an echo of the world she still believed in, a world where she had been chosen, where she had been righteous, where the deaths of children were stepping stones toward a divine future. I studied her carefully. Her eyes did not flinch when the prosecutors arranged their files. She did not look toward the gallery where the victims' families sat holding tissues and hands and breath. She seemed to occupy a reality that existed parallel to ours, one where consequence was a concept for other people. When the judge called the court to order, the room settled into a silence so complete it felt alive. The prosecution began not with dramatics, but with a simple, devastating statement. This case is about two children who never had a choice. The words seemed to hang in the room, expanding until no one could escape them. Lori did not respond. Her expression did not change. She had mastered the art of dissociation long before she entered that courtroom. What followed was a careful reconstruction of the world she and Chad had built. The prosecutors walked the jury through messages, audio clips, and testimonies. They painted a landscape of belief so distorted it had become indistinguishable from madness. I watched the jurors shift in their seats as they heard references to light and dark spirits, to heavenly councils, to missions of purification. The absurdity of the ideology clashed violently with the brutality of the crime. That collision was the heart of the prosecution's case. This was not a mother overcome by circumstance. This was a mother empowered by delusion. Witness after witness stepped forward. Detectives described their attempts to locate the children, their encounters with shifting explanations and evasive behaviors. Friends described Lori's transformation from lively and charismatic to distant and fanatic. Family members described conversations that now sounded like warnings they had failed to understand at the time. The most emotional moments came from those who had known the children personally. Teachers described JJ's laughter, his need for routine, the way he lit up when he understood something new. A relative recalled Tylee's fierce protectiveness, her instinct to shield her brother from chaos. In these testimonies, the victims became children again, not case numbers or forensic remains, but two lives filled with ordinary hopes. The defense team sat rigid and cautious. Their strategy was to separate Lori from responsibility by suggesting she had been manipulated by Chad, that his influence had eroded her judgment. They painted her as the vulnerable one, the follower, the believer swept into a tide stronger than herself. I watched the jury closely during this argument. Some leaned back, some squinted. None looked convinced. Belief can explain behavior, but it cannot excuse murder. At one point, the defense presented the idea that Lori had not wanted the children dead, that she had truly believed they were protected spiritually, that she thought their physical absence was temporary. It was a fragile argument, one that collapsed under the mountain of evidence showing deliberate actions to conceal their bodies, deceive investigators, and silence those who questioned her. Delusion may confuse the mind, but it does not accidentally bury children in a backyard. When my turn to testify arrived, I walked to the witness stand with the calm that comes from repetition. I had testified in many trials, but this one carried a personal gravity. I had traced every step of Lori's life leading to this moment. I had stood above the graves. I had read the messages in which she accepted the spiritual deaths of her children without grief. The jury needed not my emotions, but my clarity. The prosecutor began with straightforward questions. I explained the timeline of the disappearance, the efforts to locate the children, the inconsistencies of Lori's statements. We moved then to the belief system. I described how Lori and Chad had categorized people into light and dark, how they believed dark spirits inhabited bodies, how they had declared that these spirits needed removal. As I spoke, I saw jurors leaning forward, absorbing the logic behind the madness. It was important for them to understand that the crime did not emerge in a moment of chaos. It emerged from a fully constructed worldview. Then came the hardest part. The prosecutor asked me to describe the condition of the remains. I spoke clinically detached, but not indifferent. JJ had been bound. Tylee had been dismembered and burned. These were not ambiguous indicators. They were acts performed with intention. The courtroom remained silent as I spoke, a silence so complete it felt like the entire building was listening through its walls. When cross-examination came, the defense attempted to push the idea of Lori as a passive participant. They asked whether Chad could have acted without her knowledge, whether she might have been misled, whether her belief system impaired her understanding of reality. I answered honestly. Belief can alter perception, but it cannot erase agency. Lori had made decisions. She had taken actions. She had participated. After the testimonies concluded, the prosecution called one final expert, a psychologist who specialized in religious extremism. His analysis was chilling in its precision. He explained how ideologies that divide the world into pure and impure often lead to dehumanization. How once someone has dehumanized a target, violence becomes not merely possible, but inevitable. He explained that Lori did not suffer from a disorder that prevented understanding right from wrong. Her actions were willful. Her beliefs provided justification, but not compulsion. The final days of the trial felt long and heavy. The evidence had painted a picture with no empty spaces left. The jury's task was not to interpret mystery, but to decide responsibility. In the gallery, the faces of the victims' families shifted from grief to exhaustion to a quiet, restrained hope that accountability was within reach. When the judge instructed the jury and sent them out to deliberate, the room exhaled collectively. Hours passed. Conversations murmured quietly. People paced. A storm rolled across the sky outside, thunder cracking like a reminder of the gravity of what was unfolding inside. When the jury finally returned, the room hushed so suddenly it felt like a vacuum had opened. I watched them enter, each step deliberate, each expression unreadable. The foreperson stood. The judge asked the questions one by one. On the charge of first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan. Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Joshua Vallow. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty. On the charge of concealment and destruction of evidence. Guilty. The words echoed through the room, reverberating off wood and stone and human breath. Lori did not cry. She did not gasp. She simply stared ahead, her composure finally resembling not serenity but emptiness. The ideology that had once protected her from consequence had dissolved, leaving her face bare to the truth she had spent years avoiding. In the gallery, someone sobbed quietly. A relative of the children gripped the hands of those beside them. Outside the courthouse, news organizations prepared their headlines, but inside the courtroom there was no triumph, only finality. Justice was done, but justice is never victory. It is recognition. It is naming the truth aloud. As people filtered out of the room, I remained seated for a moment longer. My role was complete, but the story lingered inside me. I thought about how easily belief had mutated into violence, how quickly love had been replaced by delusion. I thought about the children not as victims of ideology, but as human beings whose lives were stolen by it. Later, as I stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, the clouds had broken slightly and sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashed, but I did not stop. There was nothing more to say on that day. The trial had spoken. The truth had been carved into record. But justice, I knew, was only the beginning of understanding. And the deeper story of how a mother became a believer and how belief became a weapon was still unfolding in the quiet spaces between everything that had been said aloud. The final chapter awaited beyond the verdict in the long shadow of what comes after justice. Closure is a word people reach for when they need something to hold on to. It sounds clean, definitive, almost gentle. But in my experience, closure rarely exists. What exists instead is aftermath, a landscape reshaped by loss and silence and the ghosts of questions that never receive answers. Long after the verdict in the Vallow Daybell case, long after the courtroom emptied and the cameras turned toward the next headline, the echoes of this story continued to move through the lives of those who survived it, and through mine. In the weeks following the trial, I found myself returning again and again to the files, not because I doubted the outcome, but because something in me was not ready to let the story settle. I had spent months tracking the disappearance of 2 children, months understanding the psychology behind their deaths, months unraveling the logic of a belief system that turned a mother into a soldier for a false prophecy. And yet, when the trial ended, the story felt unfinished in a way that lingered like a bruise deep beneath the skin. Justice had been served, yes, but justice is only the quiet answer to a louder tragedy. The first time I visited the cemetery, it was late afternoon. The air was cool but still. The world felt paused in a way that matched the weight inside me. Tylee and JJ had separate markers, each simple, each carrying names that now existed in public consciousness far beyond what their short lives should have held. I stood there a long time without speaking. Investigators, for all our training, are not immune to grief. We simply learn to greet it differently. As I stood among the headstones, I imagined the life the children might have had. Tylee, who would have been in college by now, studying something that challenged her sharp mind. JJ, still in grade school, maybe learning to ride a bike without training wheels or memorizing dinosaur facts with enthusiastic precision. Futures that had shape and texture. Futures stolen quietly, methodically wrapped in the fabric of corrupted belief. I wondered how much they understood of what was happening in their final days. Whether Tylee sensed the shift in her mother. Whether JJ clung to the familiar until the end. These are questions no investigation, no trial, no piece of evidence can ever answer. Some truths are buried with the dead. In the months that followed, I spoke with family members who were still trying to make sense of the loss. Their grief was not a single wound patched over with a verdict. It was a constellation of wounds that opened and closed unpredictably. Some described feeling relief, knowing the children had finally been found. Others described guilt, the cruel kind that grows from believing they should have seen something sooner. All described anger directed everywhere and nowhere at once. One relative said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. She said that the hardest part was not the loss itself, but the way the loss forced them to reconsider every memory. Every smile, every argument, every quiet moment became a question mark. Was Laurie already slipping into delusion then? Was she already seeing her children as something other than real children? Every memory had become a puzzle, and every piece of the puzzle carried a sting. Grief is rarely linear. It loops, twists, resets. It returns in the middle of the night when the world is quiet. It returns in the middle of a store aisle when a stranger's child laughs in a familiar way. It becomes part of you even when you do not invite it. As for Laurie, she remained in custody as her legal battles continued. Reports drifted out from the jail describing her as calm, confident, still speaking of spiritual missions and divine purposes. Her detachment from reality did not crack even under the weight of 4 guilty verdicts. It was as though she had built a fortress inside her mind, a place where responsibility did not exist and where she was eternally justified. The world called her a murderer. She called herself chosen. Delusion is a powerful shield. Chad awaited his own trial, an outcome still pending, but his role in the tragedy was undeniable. His voice had shaped the ideology. His teachings had given Laurie the language she needed to justify the unthinkable. His property had held the remains. And though the courts would eventually determine his fate in the eyes of the community, he already stood convicted by the weight of what had been discovered on his land. People often ask me whether I believe Laurie and Chad ever felt remorse. It is a difficult question. Remorse requires the capacity to see reality clearly, to understand cause and effect without distortion. I am not convinced they ever had that capacity. Their world had become too insular, their logic too circular, their hierarchy of light and dark too rigid. Remorse belongs to the sane, and sanity had left them long before the children did. In quieter moments, I would replay certain scenes in my mind. The first welfare check when Laurie smiled too brightly. The empty townhouse strewn with small signs of abandonment. The surveillance footage of Laurie laughing in Hawaii, 1,000 miles from the truth she refused to name. The moment the shovel struck earth on the Daybell property. The silence that followed each revelation. Memory is a difficult companion. It never leaves willingly. But amid the heaviness of the case, there were moments of unexpected humanity that helped carry the weight. A detective who stayed long after shift to organize files so the children's story would be told accurately. A teacher who brought in a drawing JJ had made years earlier, as if reminding the room that he had once been a little boy with crayons and imagination. A neighbor who admitted through tears that she wished she had asked more questions when the house grew too quiet. These moments did not change the ending, but they softened the edges around it. As the case faded gradually from headlines "Life in Idaho," slowly returned to a version of normal. The Daybell property was cleared, its soil turned and cleaned, though nothing could remove the memory of what had been found there. The community mourned quietly, not with vigils or marches, but with a collective lowering of the voice. Some tragedies leave behind monuments. This one left behind caution. I continued my work, taking on new cases, tracking new stories, but this one stayed with me differently. It was not the brutality alone that left its mark. It was the way brutality grew from belief. The way a mother transformed her love into something monstrous under the guidance of a man who believed himself prophetic. The way ordinary people can lose themselves entirely when seeking meaning in the wrong places. One evening, months later, I drove past the edge of the Daybell property on my way to interview a witness for another case. The sun was low, stretching shadows across the land. Grass had grown back, the air felt deceptively calm. I slowed the car and looked through the window at the place where so much had been hidden. Something in the scene struck me. Nature had already begun reclaiming the space, smoothing over the scars, folding horror back beneath green blades and wind. The earth forgets faster than people do. I parked the car for a moment, thinking about the strange duality of this job. On one hand, we bring truth into the open. On the other hand, we carry the truths that can never be erased. We are archivists of human darkness. We preserve what others would prefer to forget. It is a necessary burden, but a burden all the same. When I returned home that night, I opened the case files one last time. I read through the timeline from beginning to end. The photographs, the messages, the statements, the evidence, the verdict. Then I closed the final folder and placed it gently on the shelf reserved for cases that change you in ways you cannot articulate. There are stories you finish, and there are stories that finish you. Before shutting off the light, I found myself whispering something I had not expected, a small promise spoken into a quiet room. I will remember you, not as evidence, not as tragedy, but as children who deserved a life far longer than the one they were given. The world will move on, as it always does. But some of us carry what cannot move on. We carry the echoes, we carry the questions, we carry the responsibility of honoring the truth even when the truth brings no comfort. In the end, that is the closest thing to closure we ever receive. Not silence, not certainty, but remembrance.